right, so welcome to the webinar sponsored by the KYNT3 and the Kentucky National Board Certified Teacher Network on Renewal. We've already talked a little bit about our Zoom platform, so I'm not going to go over that again. I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Suzanne Farmer, and I'm a board certified teacher, and I work on the KYNT3 grant.
Hi, I'm Hollie Bloodworth. I'm the president of the Kentucky MBCT Network, and we're glad to have you on today.
Hi, I'm Renee Yates, and I am an MBCT renewal. I just renewed back last year in 2016, and I currently work with the Kentucky Department of Education on loan from my home district, which is Boyle County.
Hi, I'm Renee Boss, and I teach at Lafayette High School in Lexington, Kentucky. I also am a renewal. I renewed in 2017, and actually renewal is what took me to the classroom again. I had been out for a few years, so really glad to be here.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for helping out today on this beautiful Sunday. So it's renewal can really kind of sneak up on you, and we're going to take a look at the timeline to think about if it's time for you to renew. I know there may be people that are thinking about planning ahead and getting ready for renewal, or people that are at the last opportunity to renew that are trying to decide if this is what they want to try to take on this spring. So, some eligibility requirements. Hollie, did you want to go over these?
Sure. So you need to make sure that your initial or your renewed certificate is still valid. So if you let it completely expire, then you have to start over. So make sure that you have a still valid certificate, that you have a current teaching license, and that you're in your 8th year or 9th year or 18th or 19th, depending on, or 10th, 8th, 9th, or 10th, or your 18th, 19th, or 20th, depending on if this is your first time to renew or your second time to renew. So you do have a few years to play with. You start getting those notices and things so that you don't wait till the very last minute. So
I get a lot of questions on what they mean by 8th, 9th, and 10th year. And so I thought it might help if we gave a couple of examples. So for example, I certified in 2004. So I would have actually done my initial certification in 2003, 2004, that school year. I earned my certification in 2004, so I would have expired in 2014. So the 2 school years that I could renew would be the 12-13 and 13-14, because you have to submit before the certificate expires. So the 14-15 year would have been too late. I would have expired before I would have found out if I certified. So that's when they're saying 8th, 9th, and 9th, 10th. What they mean is that the 13-14 year, if you expire in 14, would be the 9th, 10th year of your certification. So. All right. These are the current dates and deadlines for renewal this year that you need to register and pay the fee by the 31st, which is this Wednesday. So if you haven't done that already, I would urge you to go ahead and register and pay your fee. That withdrawal deadline is the same, and then you can submit anytime between April 1st and May 16th. And then you should find out your renewal, it says in November, and I think that was when both of the Renees, or actually Renee Yates, you renewed the year before last, right? Renee Boss, you were this year?
Yes, I renewed in 2016, but my actual expiration date was 2017.
Okay.
So one of the advantages to going ahead that year before you expire is that if you for some reason don't pass renewal, you get feedback on parts that you didn't pass, and you only have to resubmit those parts. However, when I renewed in 2016, my certificate still went ahead and said 2017 to 2027. So I didn't lose a year by going ahead and doing it a year early. So plus I didn't feel that pressure of like, have to do it and it has to be all correct the first time. So I would highly recommend, if you can, to go ahead the year before you expire and get that out of the way, just because of those reasons.
Yeah, that's really great advice, because really you just never know what could come up, So if you get that started early, then you do have a little bit of flexibility then. So I think that's great advice.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and actually, it's scored holistically. So, the way that it, so you would need to resubmit the whole thing, but you could revise some of what you've already written, if that makes sense. So it's a little different than in the past where you bank a certain component and retake parts of it. You still submit the whole thing again, but because of the timing of you're allowed to, and we'll go over some of the timing of when things have to be, your videotape, when that has to be done and that kind of thing. It's not like you have to do completely new lessons if you don't want to for that renewal. So that's good advice. Okay. And this is just a basic one, but the cost to renew is $1,250. A question that I get a lot from people is if there are any in Kentucky is or do I know of any scholarships or fee subsidies for renewal? And I don't, other than that sometimes you can apply for things through, let's say, KEA, through your local, or maybe through a professional organization. You could always ask. I encourage people to ask those questions to their district. I asked my district when I went through renewal, and that was not approved at that time, but someday it might be if enough people ask. I know that there are districts that have considered it and may be more likely to consider it, or if they just know there's a demand for that. However, I am not an accountant and I cannot advise you on your finances, but I wrote it off on my taxes and got that approved with my accountant because I would have taken a pay cut if I did not renew. Because of the $2,000 stipend, I was still receiving the stipend, and even though your rank change is permanent in Kentucky, the stipend is not. So to keep the stipend, it was, I could write that off on my taxes. So.
I wish I would have thought of that.
Somebody advised me that when I was at a renewal training. So Renee, do you want to tell us your story about renewal?
Sure. So in speaking to which year to renew, I'll also just add that I was eligible to renew in the 2015-2016 year. I actually paid my fee and began thinking and planning. I even went to one of the KEA renewal workshops that was really good and helpful. And then I had an unexpected life event that caused me to defer my work on the national board renewal for a year. And so when it came time to do it, I had just the 1 year to renew and certify, or I would have lost everything. So thankfully, everything worked out that 1 year. And what happened for me during that year, I was borrowing a classroom. I had been away from teaching for 8 years. I worked for the State Department of Education. I worked for an education nonprofit doing a lot of different literacy work around the state and even around the country. And the year that I chose to renew, I had been for 3 years working very closely with teachers on curriculum design and really enjoying what I was doing. But ultimately, it was when I borrowed a classroom of one of those teachers that I had been working with and went and taught 10th graders that I realized I really missed teaching. And so I finished out, actually this past August was my first year back to the classroom, and I'm now happy to be teaching high school English again, and found out, of course, a couple months ago that I did indeed got my certification renewal. One more thing I'll say about why to renew early is that if you can and not have to defer it, is that because of the way EPSB works on certifications, I lost initially a few months worth of my stipend. So EPSB, my certificate expired June 30th. Even though my national board certificate was good until November, I was not eligible to receive the stipend from June until I found out again that I passed and got all that paperwork back through. So for basically those 6 months, I could not receive the stipend. They did eventually give me back pay or whatever, but it was a hassle, unexpected. So renew early if you can. It'll be worth it. And if you're not in the classroom and you're thinking about returning, you never know. It might make you decide to do that. If you have more curiosities about my return, I can see that Suzanne shared with you the blog post I wrote about returning. Really happy that I've done that, made that decision.
Thanks, Renee. And I think it's a great story. I put that in the chat too for people to follow the link, but a great story about how Renewal made you miss the classroom more. One of my very favorite quotes, or probably my favorite thing that is said about Renewal, and one of my favorite explanations of the architecture of accomplished teaching is a quote from the Profiles on Professional Growth resource that is the directions for Renewal on page 4. They describe the architecture of accomplished teaching as a metaphor for what accomplished teachers do, not just in the classroom for instruction, but also their self-reflection as accomplished teachers for their professional growth. And I just think it's a really nice explanation of how the architecture can be used in this parallel way. So I know when I chose to renew that that was what was most helpful for me personally, was an opportunity to really think about what I'd accomplished since initial certification. It was really a nice reminder. The 5 core propositions and the architecture are what teachers are measured against or assessed during renewal. Hollie, can you take us through that a little bit?
Sure. I think that's a really great part of renewal, is that if you have kind of gotten away from looking at your standards and the 5 core props and that body of knowledge that, you were so immersed in when you initially certified, this kind of gets you back into that thinking about how you've grown since that first time. So, the 5 core props are what the standards are kind of based on too. So, I won't have to read through all of them, but throughout your PGEs, these are the things that you're trying to demonstrate, that you have still stayed committed to your students, that your content knowledge and pedagogy are still relevant, and that you're still continuing to learn and grow, that managing and monitoring and thinking systematically about your practice, and that being a member of learning communities in a variety of different ways. All of those things are still relevant to wherever you are in your teaching journey now. So whether you're in the classroom or out of the classroom, it still stays connected to impact on student learning. So just dig back in, maybe pull out the standards that you used that when you first certified, and look at those notes that you made and think about how you've grown in your practice since then. this green book is kind of fresh off the press. You may, it was just updated in 2016. So if you certified a while ago, you may not have even seen this. And it is, it's the 5 core props, but it kind of, talks about each one in some, gives you examples and things to think about. It's written for teachers, by teachers. And so there's a digital version online. So take a chance to read through that and kind of reflect on your growth with that nice tool.
One of the things I was thinking about a lot when I was looking through this resource, it's been a little while since I've renewed, was that Holly mentioned that we really study our standards when we certify for the first time. Because the standards are written very specifically for each certificate and developmental area for your content of what you're teaching. And many people when they renew are like both of the Renees. They'll hear they were not in the classroom when they went through renewal, and often our journey as NBCTs take us to larger systems or in a different educational direction than our initial certification. And so I think that's why there's so much focus on the Green Book and the 5 core propositions and the architecture, is because those tools are written for all educators. So if you're doing something very different than your initial certification, obviously you'll want to look at your certification standards when you're demonstrating that you can still teach within your certificate area. But these more general resources may be more helpful for you as you're thinking about your PGEs in a broader context. And we're going to talk about what that even is if you haven't dug into your directions yet, PGEs. So. The evaluation rubric, as we mentioned, it's a little different. That when you certified, you were not just measured against the 5 core props and the architecture, but you also measured against your certification standards, and it's a little different for renewal. One thing is that's a little different, as we mentioned, you only get 1 score. So you're either going to get a score that you achieved or did not. And you have to show evidence of your continued professional growth since your initial certification. And there's several things that they're really looking for here. I'm not going to read those, but one of the things that I bolded was that they specifically mentioned they're looking for standards-based instruction. And I think that in the world that we live in right now, when we hear standards-based instruction, at least in Kentucky, we often immediately think about Common Core standards or NGSS. And I think here, because this is a national board document, they're referring to the national board standards rather than content standards. Not to say that we want to ignore those content standards, but that when they are saying standards-based in your certificate area, because you still do need to demonstrate that, that's the time to really be reminding yourself about what those standards are. Yeah. Another thing that I think is important to call out on this list is that one of the things that I hear about for people that are either doing a lot of renewal training for people or have talked to a lot of people that have renewed, renewal pass rates are much higher than initial certification rates. But not everybody that renews on the first is successful on the first try of renewal. And I'm often told that the ones that are not successful are often people that forget that they still need to talk about impact on students. Just like with the initial certification, if you're not talking about how you're impacting students, then you're not going to certify. With renewal, it talks about in the directions a lot, indirect and direct. So like you may feel that your impact on students is a little more indirect, but you need to think about how you're still impacting students. So if you're impacting other teachers in their practice, that is then in turn impacting students, then that could be a way that you impact students. So anything else on this list? Please. The specific rubric has a lot of text, but we actually included all of it. I'm not going to read it, but it's across actually 4 slides. wanted to take an opportunity, if there's something in this text that you wanted to call out or question, we can point out specific phrases here too. Or you can put it in the chat if there's something that stands out to you on this slide.
I think, and I think we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I think when I first started thinking about renewal, I thought, oh, I won this award. That'll be a great, PGE. But that's not the kind of thing that I used at all, because when you read through that, you see that it's really about showing your, how you've grown as a teacher, not like just awards or anything like that. It's really about impact on students. And so that really kind of colors the things that you choose as your PGEs.
And I'll add to that, Holly, because really when I think about what it was that had me returning to the classroom, it was the fact that, sure, I had done all these things professionally over the course of the time I was away from the classroom. But when it was when I got back in working with the students and thinking about how curious and inquisitive and invested they were in our learning, and how I was like analyzing that again and reflecting on meaningful learning, that I realized just how much I missed that. And so I really like that Renewal is still thinking about the meaningful impact on student learning, even if we're not still teaching. And I would have been fine. I could have continued what I was doing because I was able to show impact on student learning, even though I didn't have my own classroom. But ultimately, it led me back. But there's lots of room there to focus on reflecting on how students are learning and the different types of work to do.
Thanks. So another piece of the rubric, there's 4 large chunks. They said there's actually this specific call. It looks, very heavy on technology.
Right. And I thought that was interesting, I think we all are much more tech savvy than even a few years ago. So it's not a difficult thing, to work into your PGE, but it's specifically called out. So make sure that you do include that.
And I like that as they call out technology, it's not just technology for technology's sake, but how you use technology to impact teaching and learning.
Right.
And also not just, that it's really for a broad audience of people that you're working with, including, parents in the community.
Mm-hmm.
All right, the third big rubric piece. This is the piece where you really have to demonstrate that you still have your teaching chops in your certificate area where you're initially certified, which is one part of Renewal, is demonstrating that you can still teach in your certificate area.
Right. So if you are borrowing a class for this, make sure it's a class in your certificate area.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
And I'd like to add here the piece about equity of access, to me, really stood out in the renewal process more than the initial certification 10 years ago. I think that focus on equity of access for all students is a big piece for renewal, especially when we're thinking about access to students and then to our colleagues as well as parents and the community at large. But I felt that was a focus that was different from initial certification. So something to really keep to the forefront. And I know I read that part in the standards a lot, just to kind of keep my mind going in that direction.
I'll just add about that. I have had conversations with people when you're making sure that you're renewing in your certificate area, that you're being really specific about the grade level. Some of the people that I talked with said that there can be a little bit of potential confusion if you're not really careful. So just be really careful that you work with the right, not only the content area, but the right grade age level of students as well.
The ages for each of the developmental levels of the certificate areas should be online, but if you have questions about that, you can also reach out to 1-800-222-TEACH. I think that 51% of the class has to be in that age. So we get this question a lot in elementary schools because early childhood and middle childhood generalists sort of overlap, and like at how old can they be to be in each category. And so you want to look at the age that they say, because they don't have grade level assignments. It's more of an age assignment for each of the developmental levels, and just make sure that the average, more than half of the class, is in that age range. So I broke this up a little bit to tell my renewal story, and then we'll look at the last rubric piece. When I initially certified, I was a preschool teacher, and was in a different school district than the school district when I renewed. And when I renewed, I wanted to renew for several reasons, but when I renewed, one of the things that was a really nice benefit of that was that because I was required to videotape my instruction in my certificate area, which was early childhood generalist, I was able to sort of take that opportunity to collaborate more heavily with the classroom teachers in the building that I was teaching in. Sorry about the dog. At that time. So anyway, I actually intentionally reached out to a teacher that was really highly respected, and she was a second grade teacher. And in Kentucky, I'm only certified to teach kindergarten and preschool because of I'm an IECE certification. So I wanted to kind of prove to people that I could teach older students in the classroom and prove it to myself. So we co-taught for a while, and then I did basically some solo teaching, and it really made a difference in my relationship with the colleagues in my building, because they were able to see that I could do that, and I wasn't just the teacher who pulled small groups of kids all day, but that I could teach the classroom. So I was able to earn a lot of respect. I didn't have to do that. I could have, I think, videotaped my kids technically in intervention or or stayed within kindergarten in the classroom. But to me, it was really important to videotape a whole group, a whole classroom. So that was when I chose to renew, and one of the things that I found to be most beneficial about it was it improved my relationships with my colleagues. My principal also had never had a teacher that had achieved board certification while at that school. So going through the renewal process, I was able to kind of educate her on the rigor of that reflection. All right. Last part of the rubric for certifying. Heavy on professional growth. And to me, one of the things that really stands out about this slide is that it should be varied or multifaceted.
Right. Me too. Just which gives you some flexibility too, and that multifaceted look at yourself, I think can be really powerful. Just to see how much you've grown and in what ways, and how have you grown as a teacher leader, or just all kinds of things. So I know I enjoy like reading renewal candidates things, because it's really interesting at how their NBCT journey has then pushed them out into other directions too, as teacher leaders a lot of times.
There's some really nice language in the directions around renewal about how NBCTs are often leaders in their field, and some strong language there. There was actually a study, and I just remembered this just when you were saying that, Holly. There was a study that I remember a colleague of mine read a few years ago that came out of Ohio around the impact of NBCTs as teacher leaders. And this was before other people were really starting to look into that research. And in this particular study, what they found was that NBCTs, they didn't necessarily see a huge correlation if you were a initial certified, but they saw a gigantic increase once somebody was at renewal, and that renewed NBCTs had a huge level of leadership outside of their classroom, which isn't that surprising because, like you were saying, Holly, that we see that once people achieve, they immediately, often doors open, or NBCTs want to do the next thing and are really excited about their practice. So once somebody's been certified for 10 years, we often see huge gains in leadership at that time. All right, so we're going to dig into the pieces. The profile of professional growth is what it's called, and there's components within that. And that there's a document that has all of the directions, and it can be a little misleading. There's a couple of documents that are like at a glance and things, but it's honestly the thing that you want that has all the directions. You will want to read everything, but the thing that concisely sort of has all of the directions and description of it, which is where a lot of this information that we're about to dig into comes from, is the document that's called the Profile of Professional Growth. We've already mentioned that it's a single submission and scored holistically. It has components that are interrelated, and we're going to walk through that a little bit. But one of the things that's really great about it is that you select your group of professional growth experiences. So you decide what you want to write about, but that also comes a challenge of figuring out what you want to write about. So it's really great, but it's also one of the hardest things, I think, is determining what your areas are. So developing your PGEs. I know I've done this exercise. I think Holly and both of the Renees have done this to figure out kind of what your PGEs are. This is some advice I was given when I went to Renew, and it really, really helped, just taking about 15 minutes to write all of the things you've done since certification on slips of paper. And then trying to sort them to find themes.
Mm-hmm.
I
was just going to say, I remember last year working with someone, and they just couldn't decide. It was kind of like they were trying to write about something, but they didn't feel like enough. And then they were trying to write about something else, and it didn't feel enough. And when I looked at it, I thought those two things are so connected and so like they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Put them together, And so when you start looking for those themes, then you can group things so that you have more to write about. And because it's like, it makes it more multidimensional too, because, they're grouped up. And I kind of, with the term that I used with her, the girl that I was working with, I said, well, it's kind of like supersizing it. So you're taking those things and connecting them together kind of for a supersized component on, like for hers, I think it was like reading. It was, I can't remember what we called it exactly, but it was kind of like all the things she'd learned about reading to make herself a better reading teacher, like doing like her work with the Kentucky Reading Project and the things that she'd done with her like family reading nights at her school, and all these things that were interconnected to kind of create a supersized reading type PGE. So I don't know what kind of supersized things have you seen people sort of put together?
I worked recently with someone who was thinking about renewing, and we did the sorting exercise like Suzanne mentioned. And it was interesting to sort of ask the candidate questions to reveal a theme, that then with the theme through all of the different buckets, she was able to say, oh, this is, she saw for herself, oh, this is how I can connect everything together. But it was more of her coming to that realization through and I use the word, the theme word, looking for that common thread on all the different buckets. And then I thought that was a helpful aha moment when she found her thread. Then she was ready to go, because then that kind of sparked other ideas to happen. But it's like you said, I think Suzanne or Holly, one of you two said, it's really not about the awards that you've received. It's not about a conference that you presented at in particular. It's really about how you've grown your colleagues, yourself, and then your students, I think.
Right. Renee, did you come up with some themes for yourself when you were renewing? Do you remember?
I do remember, and I did have some themes, and I'll be honest that, like what Renee Yates said, I also started thinking, wow, I mean, I've presented at dozens and dozens of conferences in the last 10 years, but when I really started looking more closely, I was able to realize that what really mattered were some of the things I was doing more closely with teachers that was directly having an impact on their classrooms. For example, I've done a lot of work with teachers working on writing about their practice in blogging and writing op-eds and things of that sort. And so that became a great way for me to think about teacher learning as one of my buckets, but when I got into it, it was about the writing and teacher leadership that went along with that. So that's just one little example.
So an example for myself is sort of just like what Renee Boss mentioned. I kind of came around to the focus on assessment literacy, because I've done lots of work around assessment literacy with KDE over the last 8 years through the leadership networks. But when I was trying to fit leadership networks into Renewal, I found that wasn't a good fit to get to that evidence on impact of student learning. But then when I found the thread of assessment literacy, I was able to really see how that work could be shown to impact student learning. So it was almost like a natural fit with every one of the components in the renewal process. So it's just coming up with that thread and that overall broad, I think, aspect of certification is kind of the hard part. But then once you get that part down, it seems to flow easily. At least it did for me.
I agree. For me, I had some of my struggles when I was trying to figure out my themes and my buckets, my PGEs, was I was too narrow, like Holly had mentioned, and I had to kind of broaden to make some things work. And I also really struggled with, since my initial certification, almost that entire time during my, until I renewed, I had specialized in math. And so I had a big pivot in my learning that wasn't really reflected in my initial certification, that I had immersed myself in the content knowledge and then like the differentiation that comes along with that in math. So like I was really kind of struggling, like, do I put math in a bucket? And it ended up being that math wasn't a bucket. Math wasn't everything. And that the buckets, I also really struggled feeling like technology might be a bucket for me, because I had done a whole lot and gotten a lot of attention around technology. but it wasn't. It was how I used technology in each of those buckets. So technology actually was spread across my buckets, but that doesn't mean that's the right decision for anyone else. But for me, it made sense to integrate that into all my buckets and integrate math into all my buckets, which was another big focus for me. So as you're thinking about the buckets, another important piece is to think about then what you have to do. And once you have your 4 PGEs, there are some things that you have to demonstrate with a couple of them. So then thinking about which of those align with what you have to do next. So, oh, sorry, Renee. We talked a little bit about your story. I don't know if you have more to share. We've been talking about it along the way.
So I kind of like what we've talked about before. After certifying with National Board, it kind of jump-started a whole change in career, kind of. With the Department of Education, and I've spent the last few years as an instructional specialist with KDE. And as soon as I decided to go ahead and renew, I went ahead and found a classroom right away. And I think a piece that I thought I did pretty well with, that made it more comfortable, was that I visited that classroom several times just as a visitor. And I worked with a few kids on the side, just sort of as a guide on the side. I knew the teacher. She had been my intern several years ago, so I was very comfortable with her, and she was comfortable with me. And then we co-taught a few lessons because we were worried. I was worried that not having my own classroom would be a big challenge or a big hurdle. But just going through the process, it just worked naturally. I think because I did put in some of that time up front just to be in the classroom, and the kids knew me and they looked forward to me coming. And so that worked out really well. I would highly recommend doing those visits up front without any stress of trying to videotape or film. And then I even was able to work that whole situation as part of what I get to do every day with KDE, because I use the Math Design Collaborative work with the math formative assessment lessons to really focus in then on assessment literacy, not just with that classroom, but with other teachers in that school. So we turned that experience then into a PLC situation with many teachers in the school, where they were in turn learning about the formative assessment lessons. So it was really a really nice fit. And in the end, it worked out beautifully just to have the opportunity to get back with students. But it wasn't as big a hurdle as I thought it would be, not having your own classroom to work with. So if that's a concern for you, please don't let that be your big hurdle, because it worked out just fine in the end. And I would be more than happy to talk with anyone that's interested. I know we'll have our contact information up at the end of this video, hope so, at the webinar, but I'd be happy to talk with anybody about how the details of how that actually happened.
Well, and probably for you, being at the Department of Ed, probably was even helpful for you in your regular work now, just to get back in a classroom and see how, those things that you're doing with teachers and talking to teachers about every day, for you to do it, it probably added even credibility for you as the leader of a lot of those things, and just reminded you of the challenges and things that teachers have every day, and implementing a lot of the things that we talk about. So I think it probably would work both ways, if you're outside of the classroom and do get to be back in for a little bit. I think it would help you just in your work too, besides just with certification.
It did. It was great. Kind of like Renee Boss. I got a little bit of itch to think, oh, well, this would be fun to go back to.
Right. It reminds us why we do what we do.
Thanks, Renee. I hope that this picture makes sense to other people. This was sort of my way of trying to sort out what you have to do and how the PGEs connect. So once you have your 4 buckets, you'll actually write about them, all of them, in component 1. And we'll talk specifically about component 1 in a minute. But then you're also going to take one of those 4, and you have to connect it to the component 2, where you actually videotape in your certificate area, and you'll take a different one of the 4, and you have to connect that to component 3, where you're going to have to demonstrate impact on learners through learner work or videotape if you're teaching. So this is a time, like after you figure out your buckets, then you'll need to think about which of those PGEs connect best with instruction in your certificate area, and which one you could connect to any learners that you want to provide some evidence for. And we'll talk a little more specifically about the requirements for those, but those 2 have to be different that you choose to write more about. So in component 1, when you write about all of them, you have 3 pages that you can write about for each one, and 2 pages of sample products for each one. And we have a slide at the end where we'll talk a little bit about what those products might look, what that might look like.
That is a question I get a lot, is like what kinds of things. So
yeah, we'll dig into that a little bit. And then component 2, the video is only 10 minutes long. And one thing that I really like that is it's different than in initial certification is that you can stop and start the camera and have up to 3 parts in your video. And they talk a lot more about that in the directions, so definitely read those directions. Has to be a rostered class. So I know both Renees talked about borrowing a class. I actually borrowed a class too. But I couldn't have just sort of brought a bunch of kids together after school in a club situation or something like that and videotape them. Like, they actually have to be a rostered class of students in that grade level or developmental level that you teach. And this, you're only writing 4 pages. It's really not a long, in length. Initial certification or renewal isn't actually that many pages. And there's questions, of course, to guide you to think about it. But you're really, the only evidence on this component is the video.
But I think that, environment part, I think you want to make sure that whatever you video, that it does give the assessor a sense of your classroom environment and the equity, that part of teaching too.
So about the video, if I could add. So about the video, there is a piece in the directions that says the video has to have a timer or a date stamp on the bottom. And there was a feature on the camera that I was using that I could not figure out how to get that to work. But then after struggling for probably 15 hours over that piece, I found out that there's a form in the information that if you don't have that time stamp date on the video, the form is just a signed form, and that's all there is to it. So if you get to the video part and you don't have a time stamp on your camera, look for the form. And I was trying to look through my notes to find the form itself, but it was a little hard to capture or to find that form initially for me. But I did find there's a way around the time stamp date.
Oh, good to know.
And I'll just add that I also used that form, and you just have the principal at the school where you worked sign it. So it's pretty easy to use and necessary. I'm glad I didn't spend the 15 hours trying. I think that's why I used the form. I was looking for any ways that I could be proactive in those types of concerns, knowing that things always come up at the end.
And that brings up a point that on the slide that I'd forgotten to call out, that your video for this particular component has to be from your renewal eligibility window. So Renee Boss talked about how she waited until her last year that she was eligible to renew. Even so, she could have used a video from the previous year if she had one during the time when she was still eligible. And so like when Renee Yates was talking about like she could have reused things. You could reuse the video again if you don't certify on your first try and you try in your first year. You could reuse your video, but you may decide that that was one of the things that maybe prohibited you from renewing, and you may want to do a new one. But you wouldn't have to, as long as it's from the right time period. All right. Then on component 3, you have a choice. You have to show your impact on learners, but, oh wait, that should say at the bottom, excuse me, learner rather than leader. But the learner can be students, colleagues, community parents, or self. I'm not really sure what self means with this. I hadn't ever had that. I noticed that when I was getting this ready, and it never stood out to me before. And I don't know if I know anyone that has done self as the learner and videotaped or done the samples with that. But I would imagine if you did self as learner, it would probably be work samples, but I don't know because I've not thought about how self could be the learner for this sample, for this component. But so you want to think about if you want to do a videotape or if you want to do learner work samples, and we'll talk about some examples of using both. But with this one, you are not limited to that same time period as you are with component 2. So component 2 had to be during your eligibility window for renewal. This can be any time since certification that you use your videos or your work samples. And I chose to do a video for mine. And I videotaped some training I had been doing for the Kentucky Center for Mathematics for other educators in my region. And I just put up a camera one night when I was doing, it was an ongoing training, but I just videotaped one night of that training and went back and chose the pieces that I felt like gave me the most to talk about. And I used that because I felt that that would, in my situation, I felt like that was better evidence than the kind of learner samples that I was thinking I might submit. So for me, it was actually a lot easier to do the video too, because it was something that I could just put up that camera and something that I was already doing, and that I knew that the kind of things that I wanted to talk about in my PGE were really connected well to things that I could show on video in terms of, I don't remember exactly what my topic was for that bucket, but I was able to connect it really easily if I did. I knew that I could elicit that, I would have it on video. I know, Renee Boss, you chose to do learner work. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So for me, this was a really big decision, and I was back and forth and all around because everybody, it seems like I talked to, did 2 videos. And so I was really confident, though, with the type of work samples that I had from adult learners. So in my work with teachers, there were teachers who had created units of study. There were teachers who had written blogs and op-eds, and so much of that work included reflection, teacher reflection, where the teachers were writing about not only their learning, but also the impact their learning was having on their students' learning. So ultimately, I chose learner work samples. So my learners were adults, teachers who I had been working with for a while. Instead of me videotaping a session working with them, I actually pulled samples of the products that they were producing as part of our work together, and it turned out really well.
I don't remember.
Yeah, no, I would say when I say it turned out really well, I guess I say that because I'm certified, but in terms of my learning, by having to go back and look at what it was the learners that I worked with created, I was able to look more closely at my contributions as a leader by looking at the types of products. So similarly, when we look at the products that our students produce. I was looking at products that teachers I worked with produced, and analyzing those products, and so I guess that's why I say it went well.
Yeah.
Renee, Renee Yates, did you videotape or use your work?
I chose to do the videotape, and kind of like what you did, Suzanne, I just set the camera up in the corner and videotaped a large PLC job embedded professional learning session that I had ongoing with a district. And it was like my 4th or 5th visit in the district with the group of teachers. And so it just was, the beautiful part of it was just exactly part of what I do every day, what I did every day. So it was just a very natural fit. And I think really that's what this is intended to be about. It's intended to be about a natural fit in what you're doing in your everyday work, regardless of what that work is. As certified, National Board certified teachers, are we putting into practice what we are about? So I think that made it really nice for me.
And I don't really remember what I did. I was quite a while ago, but I think maybe I did a video too, because I think maybe I did like teaching a class, like a Murray State, like adjunct kind of class, something like that. I don't really remember. I need to, it's been a while. So then the last part is the reflection, where you look for overall patterns, and it's kind of where you kind of reflect on all the things that you've done, that you wrote about, and kind of tie it all together. It gives you questions to use as you reflect, and it's 3 pages. And you do talk about your next steps, because we're never finished growing. So what are you going to do then next? Like, what's your next steps? So I'm Hollie Bloodworth, and I'm an early childhood generalist. And I initially certified in 2002. So I renewed, I think the year before, my 2012 is when I expired. So now I'm good through 2022. And I was teaching 3rd grade at the time. So I honestly don't remember a whole lot about it. I remember doing all the buckets, and I remember doing my video lesson was on Latin and Greek roots. I remember that. And I remember thinking how much more vague it seemed than initial certification, but it was a really great process of reflection and thinking about how I had grown and continued to evolve as a teacher. And at that point, I was still in the classroom. So, of course, it was my own class and all of that.
So another question or a struggle I think that people have when I talk to people that are renewing is really thinking about what kind of evidence or samples you will include to demonstrate or to connect with each of your PGEs. And some things that I had thought of or have seen people use. Obviously, you could do video. You have to do video for component 2. You could also use video for component 3. You can include learner work as Renee did for component 3, but you may also use some learner work in component 1 for some of your samples there. You can use photographs with text boxes that explain what's going on in the photographs. You can include, and you can actually, there's some rules about it, but you could look at the actual requirements, but you could I had some examples where I had a picture of some kind of a work or a student demonstrating something, and then had actually made it pretty small. So the pictures were not full page pictures, but was able to include a lot on a page and talk about what was going on with each of those images in text boxes. Just like with initial certification, a lot of people use like a communication log or something, or a collaboration log, something that would show 2-way communication with any of your stakeholders. And I actually had included a little bit of a applied research or action research project that I'd done with my students as part of a graduate course I was taking. But there are a lot of things, and I thought we could open this up for other ideas that people may have, or questions that you may have around what kind of things to include. Or if Renee, if you remember any of the types of things that you may have included.
So I had several quotes from teachers, just from trainings that they had participated in and professional learning opportunities. And the quotes were specific around assessment literacy with the Math Design Collaborative work. And like you, I had I'm looking back at my portfolio right now. I had pictures of actual students doing work, and they were very small, but I was able, like you said, a picture says 1,000 words, and just with the little tiny quote at the bottom, I was able to get a lot of information in there. I had a letter from a colleague just about a long-term professional learning experience that I had had with a team of teachers. So that was, pretty impactful. And then if you have a web page, I had a picture of my home shot of my web page. And that really showed a lot of what I have to offer as far as adding to the community at large, because I use my webpage in trainings and folks use my webpage to refer back to. So that was kind of, I thought, a unique type of evidence or proof. And I'm trying to think. Then I just had some formative assessment type worksheets, I guess you would call them, or data collection sheets. I had a few of those that I had used with teachers, and a few that teachers had used with students and with classroom observations. So I was able to tie that in as far as PG, my third professional growth experience. So those were some of the things that I used that might be a little bit different than what you had on the list.
Mm-hmm.
I think my samples were pretty similar to what you have on the list, as well as similar to what Renee mentioned. I definitely had evidence of some of my own writing that I have done online. One of my entries, one of my PGEs, was related to activism in education, because I spent a good chunk of my time being an activist for advocating for change in public education. So I had an op-ed that I wrote that I was using to show some of that. Some other things, publications and things like that, where I was able to show connection to community. And then people coming back. So for one that I felt best about in that same sample was I wrote a piece for a women's magazine, and then brought a film on girls' education, international film, to Lexington, served like as the team captain. And then it wasn't just that I did that, but something happened from it. So a student at our local high school contacted me and organized a community event to do more service for education. And so I had like my communication with that student and a flyer from the event she organized, and it fit all in really nicely with that whole bucket of work on activism in education. So just maybe another example that might be a little bit different than what was mentioned.
Thank you.
Go
ahead, Holly.
I can't think of really anything different. I remember having a parent letter, like from a workshop, like a parent workshop that I did. And then it was kind of the two-way communication. That parent was saying how much they learned from that, and then asking me a follow-up question about something they could do with their child. And so that kind of back and forth email that would, following that parent workshop, I remember feeling like that was a really good piece of evidence.
I had a couple of examples of that kind of thing too. I know I mentioned that like I'd done a lot with technology and wasn't really sure where to put that or how to deal with that. And when I was looking back at some of the pieces I included, one of them was I used an app that helped me to organize my formative assessments a lot, so that I could really individualize and like take anecdotal records on all of the kids that I saw in intervention, and use that to target instruction better. But I also used, and so I had some like a page that kind of showed what that app did for me and how I organized things within that app to better use it, to better pitch my instruction. But then I also used a different app where my kids would videotape their thinking, and it was sort of like a Khan Academy type of thing where there's like a whiteboard and they could talk through the strategies that they use mathematically. And when I used that, it was an app called Show Me, and I would send the links to parents periodically to show them like over text or something like, hey, look what your child did today when they were solving this problem. And so that led to a lot of really great conversations. And so actually one of the examples I had was a text chat back and forth with a parent where I had linked her daughter's video of her solving a problem in her mathematical thinking. So you can get really creative about it. And if it's something that like I couldn't figure out how to actually print the, like to show, like to get the whole text thing, tried to work on it forever. Like how can I document the text and like take a screenshot and print the screenshot? Like I didn't know how to do it all and got very frustrated. And this was a few years back when there was not as advanced phones. And so I ended up basically recreating it using word art. Like this is like I used like little talking bubbles and kind of made it look like what the chat looked like with the parent. And I think so long as you're demonstrating, like as long as you're doing that with accuracy, I think that's fine. You need to recreate some of that. Another thing that we get a lot of questions about is that some people have heard and others maybe have not, that National Board, as they're revising the initial certification process, they're also revising the renewal process. However, that isn't changing until 2021. So if you're due for renewal now, this doesn't apply to you this time. And you'll go through the renewal that we have just talked about. But I know, Hollie, you mentioned, I think you're up for renewal in 2021. I'm up in like 2024. So, and both Renees will be up even after that. So the next time I renew, I will be in this new process, which will be called the maintenance of certificate. And we don't know a whole lot about that yet because it hasn't been released. But some of the things that we do know about it is that it's going to cost a lot less. So right now, renewal, as we mentioned, is $1,250. And we're being told that renewal, our maintenance of certificate, will cost about the same as one of the components in the new process. And a component in the new process is right around $500. So it will be significantly less money, and it will be a lighter lift. So it'll be a smaller chunk, more frequent chunk, so that it's not as long of a time lapsing before we're reflecting and thinking about how our practice is continuing to grow, which actually aligns, a 5-year cycle aligns with state licensure. So more than 40 states do a 5-year renewal for state licensure, and that's another reason why National Board looked to the 5-year process. And even though when we certified, we were used to doing a whole lot in 1 year, with the new process, we have a lot of candidates who are only doing like a component each year. And so if you were only doing a component each year, a process like the one that you're about to take on for renewal might feel a lot heavier for somebody who hadn't gone through the initial certification that we have. Even though I would say renewal is a much lighter lift than initial certification, it's still very holistic and a lot to sort out in the process that it's in now. And I would imagine that the future of the maintenance of certificate will be a lighter lift than this process of renewal that's a 10-year. Yes. Any questions about that or thoughts? All right, so I did not add a slide that has our contact information on that, but we can. So I'm gonna stop sharing for a second and I'll type that in on that last slide, and I'll open up for questions and then I'll stop the recording. Is there anything that you guys wanted to share or had questions about? I know we have a couple of guests on. If they want to grab the mic, feel free to talk, or if you're not comfortable with that and want to put your question in the chat box, you can do that too.
I'll just add, like Renee Yates did, that I'm willing to talk with anyone who might have questions. One of the best things for me during the renewal process was that I had a little cohort of people. We were self-created. Actually, Suzanne introduced me to one of the people, and it was just another person that I knew who was also going through the process. And none of us had the same content area or grades, but we all would share thoughts and ideas and really provide moral support and encouragement, and that really, really helped. So I definitely encourage you to seek others out.
I just wanted to say, this is Merritt. I'm in Louisville, Kentucky. I just wanted to say thank you all for giving up your time while my brain is swimming a little bit and I have all my papers in my binder printed out and checking it out. I feel a little bit better about the process. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and for sure, I'm not expired for another year. So this will be like the early year you all were talking about. So I'm going to definitely go ahead and do it before this January 31st deadline and move in that direction. So thank you all for taking the time and giving all the tips.
Thanks, I'm glad you found it helpful.
I would just encourage anyone that is a member of KEA to check out their resources because they have some structural resources to help kind of organize. And I found that their information was accurate and simple to follow and very, very helpful. So I think Ruth Ann Sweezy does some work with the KEA and BCT cohort groups. And Lisa Petrie-Kurt may as well still. I'm not sure if she's still doing work there with the NBCT, but I would encourage you to check them out if you are a member of KEA.
And I'm going to make one modification on the contact information.
Thanks, Renee. I just saw that.
Okay. Since I returned to Fayette County, they added a 2. I couldn't get my original email address back, so it's renee.boss2 at Fayette and the Global. So without that 2, their email will never reach me.
And I'm a 2 as well.
Man, you guys. All right, sorry. I'm like, I'm not. You're in my contacts, so I don't ever type your name. Okay, sorry. That's what I get for trying to do it on the fly. Hold on, let me try to fix it.
I get that a lot. It's not a big deal. Even after all these years, I emailed you several times, but they didn't have the 2. We're just twice as nice, Renee Boss.
There you go.
I'm trying to fix it, and now it's not. Renee Boss 2, Renee Yates 2. All right, I'm going to get it. I also, I know that for people that are in the western part of the state, that sometimes it can be easier, or there may be more resources locally through Western Kentucky or through GREC, who both do a lot of candidate support and renewal support. So that's another resource here in Kentucky. I know for me, when I renewed it, actually, just because of the timing of when the professional learning was scheduled, and where it was scheduled, it was more useful for me actually to go to a training that Lynn Hines was doing, because she came to right around where I live, right around when I needed to know. So, so I know that there's a lot of great resources out there, and I would encourage you to reach out to those to people in your area. You may also have some renewal opportunities in your district that you may not know about, or people willing to help you. If you talk to other MBCTs that have renewed, you could also go there. So you could look on the National Board website. The MBCT directory is on there, and you can see anyone whose certificate dates are more than 10 years. So anybody that would have a 20-year certificate span is somebody who's renewed, and you could reach out to those people if you know them. Even if they're retired, they could talk to you about the renewal process and might be willing to help you with that. I don't think, because I haven't talked to a lot of people that really wanted feedback on their writing with renewal. It's a lot more questions because we've gone through writing already with the initial certification. So I think people feel confident about how to write for renewal, but the questions they have are around like, do these PGEs, do they sound okay? And like helping to think through like what the buckets are, and maybe some questions about samples or evidence to include. And like, do you think these would be good evidence? And just talking to somebody about it often will help you land on better ideas. So, and looking to see if there's other people in your area that may be renewing geographically that you could get together with, like Renee did. All right, I'm going to stop recording. Now that I fixed the